Welcome to Lifegroup. In this season of Lifegroups, we're continuing to look at Tish Warren's book, The Liturgy of the Ordinary. And in one of her chapters, she talks about the church. Now, oftentimes when we think about the church and we look back at the early church, we look back at the early church with a wistful eye. We think, boy, in the book of Acts, they got it right. Sometimes you'll have preachers talk about how if we could only get back to living like the early church, then we'd be able to do something. And the truth is, the picture we get at the very beginning of the early church in Acts chapter 2 is amazing. It shows this church where people were generous in giving, where people gave up their own lives to come live with other Christians, that they really loved on one another. And we see that very clearly in a few verses in Acts chapter 2. But what we forget sometimes is that that's just a brief snapshot of the early church. A few years ago, Audra and I and the kids, we went to a studio to have some family pictures taken. And there was another family there waiting to get their pictures taken with us. And that family, nothing was going right for that family. The kids were angry and fighting with each other. The parents had obviously had some disagreements. They weren't talking to each other. They were miserable. We just avoided them, kind of stayed out of the way. Their names got called to go into the studio to have their picture taken ahead of us. And in a moment, as they lined up, suddenly smiles went on their faces. All of the worry went away. All of the anger stopped. And when they had their picture taken, you would have sworn that they were an all-American family that had everything together. But the moment they stepped out of the background, the fighting started again. And I think sometimes what we forget when we look at the early church, particularly in the book of Acts, is we get this little snapshot of a singular moment. But what happens very quickly for the early church, if you just turn the page from Acts chapter 2, is we find that almost immediately cracks in the foundation emerge. You find people starting to complain about what the preachers were doing or not doing. They started to have fights about who could be a part of the church, who could follow Jesus. When you read the letters of Paul in the New Testament, what you're really reading are his letters to churches. And in those letters, he's dealing with fights and disagreements and problems. In one letter, the book of Galatians, he basically screams at this church for the entire first chapter of Galatians. If we learn anything about the church in the first part of the first century, what we discover is that people struggled being the church. They struggled being the body of Christ together. Tish Warren writes about that in her chapter about the church. And she says this, that even though the church struggled, even though there were fights and differences, this is what happened. She said the only reason we know anything at all about Jesus is because his disciples told their friends, neighbors, and enemies about him. The apostles preached and wrote down his teaching and stories about him. And believers have carried his message everywhere they've gone in each generation. The message of hope, the message of Jesus Christ has been carried from generation to generation by the church with all of its flaws and all of its problems, all of its disagreements. The church has continued to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. And it's been difficult at times, but still, what we find in the New Testament is this truth, that there is great power, even in the brokenness of the church, there's great power for God to work. One of my favorite passages about the church is Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews was written long after the day of Pentecost. The church had probably been around for 30, 40, maybe even 50 years. And so people had plenty of time in the church. And what the writer of the Hebrews deals with is that some people have decided that they don't need to gather with other Christians anymore. Maybe they'd gotten burned by church. Maybe they were just frustrated with the way things were going. But here's what the writer of the book of Hebrews says. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. And let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. The writer knows the truth that if we're going to truly follow Christ, then we have to step into this messy, chaotic thing we call church, the gathering of the people of Jesus. Because it's there in the church that we have our proving ground. This is where we truly learn to forgive. This is where we learn to love one another. This is where we learn to put up with those who believe differently than we do. This is where we learn to put up with people who maybe just rub us the wrong way. This is where we learn to live out the love of God that we've experienced in Jesus Christ, especially when it's not easy. And every single one of us could tell stories of when it's not easy, because the church is a place that sometimes hurts people. It's a place that sometimes overlooks people. It's sometimes a place that is not as welcoming as it should be. We all have our horror stories. But even with those flaws, it's in the body of Christ that we continue to experience hope. It's where we can find the fullness of God's love. Here's what we discover when we truly give ourselves over to the church, to the body of Christ. What we discover is that we need each other. That person who believes differently than us, that we think's a heretic, well, maybe we need them to push us past some of our doubts. Maybe we need them to help us think about an issue differently. That person who hurt our feelings, or maybe the person that we wronged, we need the experience of the church so we can learn what it means to live in forgiveness together, to have hard conversations sometimes that maybe we don't want to have, but maybe hard conversations that we wouldn't have anywhere else. I think what we need in this life is we need a group, a tribe of people that we can travel with, that we can believe with, that we can disbelieve with, that can encourage us at times, that can love us when we feel unlovable, that can give us the opportunity to serve, to push ourselves, to learn more about who God has created us to be. And I think that only happens when we give ourselves over to becoming a part of the body of Christ. A few years ago on vacation, we were in a place that had a church that a lot of my friends said, you got to go try this church out. If you're ever in that area, you got to go. So I got up on Sunday morning and I went to church at this church that everybody talked about. And in church, they talked about this coffee time after worship, that if you were a guest, that you should go and just meet some folks. And so I went. I went to this coffee time, got myself a cup of coffee, and then I stood there and I waited and I waited. And you've been there. You've visited a church sometime. Maybe you visited our church and you waited and nobody came and talked to me. I began to get kind of angry and frustrated and indignant. And then I laughed. I laughed at myself because for all the conversation I'd had through the years about being the church, I was waiting on someone else to come to me and be the church for me. And so I walked up to somebody, introduced myself, and had one of the best church visits I'd ever had, simply because I decided I was going to be the church. Maybe for you where you are, it's time for you to pass all the hurt and the frustration, and there's plenty of that to go along with the church. Maybe it's time for you to make the decision, rather than wait for the church to come to me and be what I need. Maybe it's time for me to step in and to become the church that someone else needs. What might that mean for you in your life this week, in your connections, in your conversations, and in your actions?